Welcome to this week's edition of the Old Paratrooper podcast. But before we get started, I want to tell you about our new sponsors, Veterans for Veterans. If you served after 1987 and your hearing's taken a knock from your time in the forces, these are the people to speak to. They've helped thousands of veterans like us claim compensation for tinnitus and hearing loss. They're ex-military themselves, so they genuinely get it.
It's free to check if you qualify, and the claims are no win, no fee. To get started, click the link in this video or visit veteransforveterans.co.uk.
Today's guest, I am proud to announce, former paratrooper, Falklands veteran, Kosovo veteran, retired Major General Adrian Freer. Good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, good, thanks.
Thank you very much for taking the time to come on. I really appreciate it. I'm sure you're very busy. We've had a few technical dramas this morning, but that's paratroopers and technology don't go hand in hand. What I like to do, sir, is I like to start at the beginning, where you grew up, kind of what led you down the route into the military, Sandhurst and beyond. Yeah, so over to you. Whereabouts are you from?
Well, my father was in the Air Force, so I was born into a military family. My paternal grandfather was a soldier in the Queen's Own, in what was in those days the Cameron Highlanders, serving in India. And my father, in fact, was born in India, in Darjeeling, up in the Punjab. So I suppose going into the military was probably in the blood, for whatever of a better description. My mother's side were all farmers in Lincolnshire, and she had three brothers who all had too many sons. So going on the land was never an option. So I think I probably reverted to type, really, and going into the services. My father was a fighter pilot, and I wanted to fly, but I went to Biggin Hill probably at about 18 to do the aircrew aptitude and failed on eyesight. And frankly, if you can't fly, I didn't see any point in joining the Air Force, so that sort of rapidly disappeared. And then I suppose, really, as I at school, I focused on the army, and I went to a Mons Officer Cadet School, which was a leftover, really, in the early 70s from national service, when there were 2 or 3 officer cadet schools around the country. One of which was at Eaton Hall up on the Duke of Westminster's estate in Cheshire, and I can't remember where the third one was. And Mons Officer Cadet School remained in being until I think I think it closed in 72, and I went there in September 71 on a short service commission, and was commissioned into the Parachute Regiment in, I suppose, February, March of 71. P Company Abingdon, and 1 power in Hollywood Barracks in Belfast in sort of March, April 71 was the sort of early start, really. And I was to stay in 1 power.
What was the kind of the lure to the Parachute Regiment, if you don't mind me asking, sir?
Well, I suppose if I had a county I was born in Hampshire, so I suppose I would have had in those days a county affiliation to the Royal Hampshire Regiment, which is now part of the Queen's Regiment. Maternally, I would have because I spent quite a lot of time in Lincolnshire up in my grandparents', farm. Would have been what were the Royal Lincolns, who were then the Royal Anglian Regiment. And I don't know, for whatever, I don't think either of those particularly appealed, and I was sort of lured to the rather more exciting. I mean, did I know an awful lot about the Parachute Regiment at that stage? Absolutely bugger all. But I mean, it seemed like, I had no idea about P Company or anything like that, but it seemed like a good idea, and had a bit of sort of, bit of crack about it. So it was as simple as that, really. Nothing really profound that took me down that route.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hear that a lot. There's a lot of people that probably go into it a little bit blind. I was the same. I knew not a lot about it. And then I found it a bit of a shock to the system when you're going through depot and through training. And then
Yes.
obviously,
Yeah. Absolutely. No. I mean, peak, and I say a shock, but I mean, it was, I had obviously, and probably like everybody else, never done anything like that before. So that sort of concentrated the mind. Um, um, but I mean, no, I was delighted to, delighted to get through. Then after that, Abingdon was a bit of a breeze. Um, um, I mean, I sort of made sort of good friends with a few people on P Company. And one who I remember, I think, was a boy going into 216 who had done really well on P Company, strong lad. But as soon as we went up in the balloon cage at Abingdon, that was him. I never saw him again. But I suspect those are stories that other people can remember as well.
yeah, the
So
whole I was after the balloon jump. I think that's lucky I was after the balloon jump because I'm not entirely sure. And I like that people reported about the eeriness of the silence and traveling up in the
yes,
balloon. I was one of
yes.
did the sky man, but yeah, the balloon. How did you find the balloon jump, sir?
Well, I think I can't remember. I think we probably did two. And then subsequently, as a platoon commander at the depot, they used to have the balloon in Hankley. I did quite a few, really. And you could become a bit blasé about it. You could go out to Hankley Common and do 4 or 5 in the morning, which I'm not sure is particularly sensible because you tend to just sort of literally strap it on and it all becomes a bit casual. Um, but you're right. If you're sort of swinging on the end of that cable at 800 feet, with the wind sort of blowing through the cage slung underneath a barrage balloon, it's all a bit bizarre, really. But good day.
Was it one para of the first battalion you went to as a young platoon commander? Is that right?
I went to one para in Palace Barracks in '71 and stayed there really until the no, late '70s. I did a 2-year tour at the depot. Um, And then I went off to be ADC to a chap called Mike Walsh, who was ex-para when he was GOC 3 div. And then I went back to one para in, I suppose, 70, whenever the fireman strike, just before the fireman strike. Well, that was either Christmas 75 or 76. Um, and yeah, yeah, about 75. And then we had a sort of particular run then. We went on a 4 or 5 months tour in South Armagh. We then came back for a short time and went off uh, to Hong Kong for 3 or 4 months to catch illegal immigrants on the Sino-Hong Kong border. And then we came back from that, I think, or it was either that way round or the other way round, and we went off to do a pilot exercise in Fort Campbell in Kentucky for about 2 months. So we had a really, busy sort of 2 to 3 years where we were away for 4 or 5 months, back for the same, and away again. It was great if you're a single bloke, and by that stage been made the adjutant. Um, and so I stayed then with one para right the way through. And I think we went to Hong Kong it would have been either, I can't remember exactly, 78 or 79. And then I came back from there and went off to Warminster, to the junior division, the staff course, and then on to Brecon to be an instructor in sorry, probably April, May 1980. And then I did about 18 months there in Brecon, which was, really, really very valuable in terms of sort of learning one's profession. I mean, having been the adjutant of one para for sort of 2 years, I learned all about sort of, G1 or HR in current language and that. And then I went off to Brecon as an instructor, and it really honed my sort of low-level tactical knowledge, understanding, etc., etc. So it was an extremely useful time. I then went off to Lympston, to the Commando Training Centre, to teach sergeants there in low-level tactics on their command course. And then the Falklands War came around in, as you know, in April '82. So in a way, I'd had uh, and indeed fortuitously, a really good background in low-level tactics, company-level tactics, and on the G1 side in my sort of previous 4 and a bit years. And the Falklands War was really was able to to cement all that. Um, and I went up to Aldershot. So when the Falklands War started in '82, or the Argentine invasion, I was on the, I mean, obviously on the posted strength then of the Commando Training Centre, which was rapidly emptying as people were, trying to get back to commandos. And I'd gone back to Aldershot because in those days, we had to do so many jumps a year to keep your para pay. So I'd gone back up to RHQ Para to arrange to do some parachuting, keep my para pay. And I ran into Roger Patton, who was the second in command of 3 Para, who said, we need we're short of a few people. And I said, well, I'm up for that. And so I then rang the commandant of the Commando Training Centre, who was a lovely man, Henry Beverley, who said, go, I'm too old, you go, go, go. And then sometime later, I got a phone call from the regimental colonel of the Parachute Regiment, who's saying, under no circumstances are you to go. And then I had a phone call from Hugh Pipes, 3 Para, and he told me to get my ass down to Tidworth. So that's what I did. So one of the great things in life is never ask a question if you're in danger of getting the wrong answer. Just make a decision and do it. So that's how I ended up in 3 Para, off down to the South Atlantic for whatever it was, 3.5 months, which is again was well, say life changing, but I mean it brought together, not unnaturally, it brought together everything that one had trained for and taught and whatever, and was to have a profound impact really on how I trained a rifle company when I commanded one a few years later, and a battalion and everything else. So it was those sort of 4 or 5 years really, from being the adjutant of 1 Para, training on the platoon sergeant of the NCO's TAC wing at Brecon, my time at Lympston, and the Falklands War was was really centre to how I conducted business from there on in.
Yeah, it's and people, probably civilians, will find it a little bit odd that as a paratrooper trying to get to a war zone and wanting to be part of it, people will find that a very, very bizarre. But that's the nature of being a paratrooper. In fact, being a soldier, that you want to go and test yourself. And if you've had that run up, with all that kind of training and really, really good training, sergeants in tactics and honing your skills, you're going to want to put them to test, aren't you?
No, absolutely, yeah. I mean, frankly, if you're not prepared to, if you're not prepared to go on active service, then you need to look yourself in the mirror and ask yourself a serious question. And if you get the wrong answer, then you need to hand your kid in and go, frankly, because that's it. You're not a great deal of use to people. I'm not saying that in a sort of completely warlike, blood curdling, maniac manner whatsoever. But if you are a professional soldier, then that's what you join for. Hence, in my view, one of the reasons that the armed forces are struggling to recruit now is because there is, the politicians are taking no interest in the military, and that has a profound impact on whether that's going to, that won't encourage people to join, and that's one of the reasons why we're unable to recruit at the moment.
Yeah, I think the other aspects around that as well, with social media and the way now, years ago you read newspapers or you saw like the 6 o'clock news, and that was your snapshot of world events. Now, because the brutal realities of war and however they're painted, rightly or wrongly across social media, that probably deters a lot of people as well. And not only that, like you said, completely right as well, that how veterans have been treated by the military and how they're held, by the government. There's no reason people don't want to join the military, is there really?
No, no, there's not enough. Well, as I said, repeating myself, there's not enough interest shown in the armed forces. It's all it's too little, too late, really. And I mean that needs to change dramatically, particularly as where the world is today. If you want to avoid war, you need to prepare for it, and we haven't done that over the last 30 odd years. In its broadest sense, I mean, yes, there has been some tremendous stuff in and performances in Iraq and Afghanistan, and clearly some extremely fierce sort of fighting and operational service in those two theatres. But in its broadest sense, as terms of the armed forces being able to fight, high intensity warfare with the numbers and all the kit, it's been absent and remains absent.
Yeah, we see constant cutbacks in the military now. I think that we're at something like 70,000 troops or something. I don't know the numbers, but yeah, it's a bit reduced. We need a bit of an investment in the military, regardless. So obviously, when you were down south in the Falkland Islands, you was a company 2IC. Is that correct?
Yes, I was went into A Company 3 Para as the second in command, under David Collett, the OC. Hugh Pipe was the CO. I mean, I knew quite a few people in the battalion, particularly some of the senior NCOs, um, because my time at the NCO staff wing at Brecon training parachute corporals, whatever. So, I wasn't unknown, and I knew quite a few of them. Um, but I mean, I was, parachuted in, and I think I arrived at Tidworth on, literally days later. We were heading down to Southampton and sailed on whatever it was on the high tide on Good Friday, in April '82. So it was all really quite exciting, really, and completely unknown. Nobody, and of course in those days you just mentioning, there was no social media. The only thing that we could listen to was the BBC World Service. Um, and I think it took us, um, I don't know, about a fortnight plus, to get down to Ascension Island. Um, we stopped en route to refuel at Freetown in Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa. Arrived off Ascension Island. I think, about a fortnight later, something like about the 10th of April, and there was quite a big bay there. I mean, St George's Bay, which was full of amphibious shipping, NSLs and the whatever, what I would call the fighting fleet, the two aircraft carriers. They had already sailed south. That was Hermes and Invincible, and we were to remain in and around Ascension, I think, for a good week, week to 10 days, and there needed to be there was an awful lot of cross decking went on there because ships had left, um, Portsmouth, Southampton, Plymouth in at speed, and in order to be prepared for the potential rigors of the South Atlantic in terms of weather, etc. They a lot of cross decking and making sure stores are all in the right place and properly loaded. And at the same time, there was a lot of shuttle diplomacy going on, which we were able to, I say, listen to, which we were aware of from the BBC World Service. So I think Haig, who was the US Secretary of State at the time, was crossing the Atlantic in various guises between ourselves, France, the United States, and Argentina, and the UN in Geneva, trying to, come to a peaceful resolution. And but I think then we then sailed. Uh, we then sailed from Ascension on, and we did quite a lot of training on Ascension. So we were able to get ashore. We did various drills with, with landing craft and disembarking and cross-decking out of the Canberra, out of what they call the galley flats down by the waterline into LCUs and LCVPs, doing various drills. There was a bay where you could get ashore around the north, east of the island. I think we did a few tabs around. We set up ranges down at the south of the airfield, Wide Awake, and of course the airfield was a huge runway, and I think built for the. Well, I'd been there for some time, but I mean it had been extended, I think, to take the shuttle should it be necessary, and that was full of Victor tankers and Vulcan bombers and more Harriers that were in fact were to go on board the Atlantic conveyor and subsequently sunk a few weeks later. But I think when we left Ascension, I think we all realised then that this was, we were going in. I mean, all the talks had happened, and there'd been no clearly obvious resolution. If there had been a resolution, presumably we would have just turned back. So when we left Ascension round about 17th or 18th of April, that was that was it as far as. And then it was then just another 4,000 miles down to the the South Atlantic, and we went ashore, I think, on the 21st of May. About 48 hours prior to that, you had effectively three battalions on Canberra, three para 40 and 42 commandos, and somebody probably very sensibly back in London decided that that was quite a target. So we were cross-decked to HMS Intrepid for the last sort of just under 48 hours, which by that stage, when time we got on board, was on complete overload. I mean, I think there were about 15 or 1600 people on it, and the boy, everyone was sort of sleeping in galley flats and everywhere. I mean, there simply wasn't enough bunk. There were no bunk spaces at all. It was, you put your head down where you could find a space. And then I think we then sailed into San Carlos water. And before that, obviously, we'd bombed up with live ammunition, and in fact, then carrying Green East 2 81mm mortar bombs, etc.
Yeah.
And then into the landing craft and ashore. And I think we hit a sandbank, so I think we had to wade the last bit, which wasn't too bad. And there we were on, at Port San Carlos on Green Beach, going through the settlement, and very quickly, the sort of realities of war kicked in, because, and I think they got geographically misplaced, thinking they were, and this was two Gazelle helicopters from the Commando Air Squadron, overflew us, and I think they thought they were going sort of south down San Carlos water, but in fact they were going sort of east past Port San Carlos, and they were both shot down. There had been a group of I think sort of 40 odd Argentinians who were leaving. They were some way from us, and they shot down both these Gazelle helicopters, and then machine gunned. I think at least 2 of the crew were killed out of the pilot and observer each aircraft. And then very shortly after that, a Sea King overflew us with an underslung load and saw what had happened to the Gazelles, and just dumped let the underslung load go. Fortunately, not hitting not hitting anybody underneath, and turned turtle and disappeared. So I mean, it was an interesting start really to the campaign, and as I say, the realities of war kicking in, pretty bloody quickly, really. And then we had a grandstand view of the next 48 hours of the sort of the air war over Port San Carlos, when HMS Ardent and I think Antelope, a number of Type 21 destroyers frigates rather, were hit and destroyed. I think the Antelope blew up. I think the Ardent, I think she sank. And then there were other, and interestingly enough, they, for whatever reason, they didn't go because the Canberra was sitting there in San Carlos water with, clearly a huge target, but they went for the grey funnel line rather than the amphibious ships. So we had fighter jets coming over us at very low level, um, thinking that they were coming for us. But I mean, they were just using the bit of land we were on, which was sort of a promontory, as a aim, as a aiming point to go down San Carlos water. So yeah, all exciting stuff. And then a short time after that, we had various patrols out forward of the battalion defensive position, and we had a classic blue on blue, when a patrol of A Company were out, and then there was also a patrol from C Company, and they weren't on a battalion patrol net, and once so the I can't remember which way round it was, but uh, the A Company patrol was spotted by a C Company patrol who reported uh, seeing, and of course, when you're 1,000 meters plus away from somebody, you can recognise that it's somebody, but you can recognise it's a people, but you can't identify, what they are. Are they friend or foe? And anyway, grid references got mixed up, and the C Company patrol engaged the A Company patrol with machine gun fire and calling in mortar fire. Um, and 2 soldiers of A Company were very seriously injured uh, uh, before it was realised that it was a blue on blue. Uh, but again, that's the realities of war. Really, these things can happen. Mistakes can happen in the heat of the moment. And again, that brought it home to us. And of course, once that contact had happened, because there was no knowledge exactly what had happened, and there was a view that there was potentially a strongish Argentinian force north of Port San Carlos. So A Company were saddled up, and we went off on a sort of 12-hour, search and destroy. And then it became obvious that there was nothing, and we came back. And as we were coming back, I think I'm not sure if it was the CO flew up in a Sea King to sort of see us what was going on, and the pilot overcorrected on landing and took his tail rotor off. So yet again, another harsh reality. Suddenly a Sea King's flying, Sea King isn't flying. As he flared on landing, he flared it too much, and as I say, the tail rotor just came, the rear part of the fuselage just came sort of snapped off. So Interesting days.
And like you say about the blue on blue there, they are the realities of war. And obviously, back then, they happen now in the modern conflicts where we have a lot more technology. So, you're going back to 1982, the technology wasn't there as well. So you were kind of relying on kind of bits and bobs. And obviously, these things happen, don't they? It's just realities of war. And they even happen now in the modern conflicts with all the technology.
Yeah, they do. And there were 2 or 3 blue on blues in the Falklands. I think 22 had one. Um, I think one of the commanders may have done. But as you say, as you just, they are the realities of war, really. Nobody talks to these things, but circumstances, happen. And I suspect there may have been some in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't know. I was well left by then, but these things do happen.
Yeah, the Falklands is like we know about Longdon and everything else. So, when was it? How long into the conflict before you encountered like full on? If you don't mind me asking, obviously the sensitive topics. I want to ask two things about that when you encountered sort of the enemy for the first time properly, and also you talked about it being life changing. Now, I do these podcasts to raise awareness for mental health issues amongst military veterans because obviously these sort of events play on people's minds for years to come. So I want to kind of talk about the first time you encountered the enemy and also moving forward throughout your life. How have these kind of events shaped you and affected you, if you don't mind sharing, sir?
Yeah. So, I mean, there was quite a build-up, really, I suppose. So we left. I mean, there was considerable pressure on Julian Thompson, the commander, 3 Commander Brigade, good bloke, to get on from London. So, and that led really to, although we weren't aware of it at the time, that led to the 2 para going sort of off Sussex Mountains down to Goose Green. And we being on the other side of San Carlos, on the north side of San Carlos Water, along with 4 or 5 Commando, we then so we were the 2 units really that marched the whole way. So 4 or 5 went further north up to Douglas Settlement, and we then 3 para went to Teal. So we had a long. I mean, I suppose say long. I mean, all up, it was probably 60 miles. But over fairly inhospitable terrain, and we very quickly realised there's no way, you weren't gonna do that carrying a sort of 50-60 pound Bergen and everything else. Bearing in mind you're webbing with first line scales of ammunition and everything else was probably not far off, 50 plus pounds anyway, plus a weapon. And others, signallers were carrying considerably more. GPMG gunners, as you'll be aware, etc., etc. So we travelled in sort of, I say light in parentheses, light order. And in fact, those days, the old Bergen, you could take the Bergen frame off the Bergen, and you could then strap some, well, eventually you could strap a sleeping bag and whatever to it. But in the early days, we didn't even do that. We just sort of literally went as we were. So we were taken up the San Carlos River a few clicks by rigid raiders, and then off we went. And to Teal Inlet, where and we weren't sure what was at Teal Inlet, so there was a battalion, planned to attack Teal Inlet. And on the day that all went to rat shit, for a whole host of reasons. And the other sort of thing is that once we left San Carlos, well, in fact, once we landed at San Carlos back in whatever it was, 21st of May, and until it all over, really I saw nothing of the other 2 rifle companies. We were never close enough to be, to pop over and have a chat. Um, so, one's experiences are really quite narrow. So people assume if you were in the Falklands, you know all about it. You know what what 40 Commander did, what Scots Guard, etc., etc. It's absolute nonsense. You are a prisoner of what in those days with technology as it was, what you can see and what was immediately around you. So that was quite a sort of telling point. Anyway, I digress. So after Teal Inlet, we were there for about 24 hours. And again, there was then pressure to keep on moving forward. And so we set off then on another quite sort of meandering. We had to go around a very large inlet, water inlet, and to round to another settlement called Estancia. And we were there for, and again, say 24 hours. And then we then set off again up across some really quite difficult boulder fields. And we were then called to halt. And although we didn't appreciate it at the time, I think Hugh Piker decided to sort of press on. And I think Brigade Headquarters decided we just needed to sort of regroup and get balanced. And so we did. Now, part of that was caused by, although we weren't fully aware at the time, the Atlantic conveyor had been sunk. And with it, although there was one Chinook that survived, there were, I don't know how many more Chinooks were there on it, but, at least 3 or 4, plus I think some Harriers. And they all went, with a lot of other kit, went, to the bottom of the Ogden. So we then had this sort of week before Mount Longdon, and it wasn't just us; it applied to the other major units, 40 and 45 Commando, sorry, 42 and 45 Commando, where they had to bring the whole of 29 Commando Royal Artillery up, all the gun batteries and all the ammunition. You're talking about 250 rounds of gun, so that's a lot of ammunition, and a lot of helicopter work with the remaining Chinook and Sea King helicopters. So that's why there was a pause before we went on to Longdon on the 10th, 11th of June. And during that time, we did our patrol company were wrecking Longdon. And A company, we put out a few, patrols. We did some low-level night sort of rehearsal training in and around where we were, et cetera, et cetera. And then the time came, and like a lot of things, it suddenly time just became very condensed. Battalion headquarters was back at Estancia, and the only way David Collett could, he could have tabbed there, but I mean it was quite a way. And so by the time he'd gone back for the battalion O group, come back to us, and then we got interrupted during the O group by an Argentinian Picara flying over and loosing off with sort of 30mm cannon, and then we had a few incoming artillery predictive fire, because by that stage they had, I think, a half battery of 155mm outside Stanley, and we were in range for them where we were, although we weren't overlooked. But I think they were just firing predicted fire missions really around a grid square. So the whole O group, in a way, in one respect was extended, but also, although it sounds double Dutch, was condensed. And I think we then set off at about 8 o'clock at night and I think we probably had a 5 or 6K approach march, get onto the start line with an 8-hour round about midnight. And I can't remember. I think by that stage we were probably on Zulu time. The timings were all a bit bizarre in terms of local time and UK time, etc. Anyway, I can't really recall. And the whole attack was to be was silent, and go noisy on contact. um, um, and that was and then and Brian Milner was, I think, a lance corporal in B Company, I think, stood on an anti-personnel mine, and that was that really. And then it all sort of kicked off from there. And B Company was tasked to go up the ridge line on the mountain. We were tasked. We were to take a piece of what looked on the map on the contours high ground just to the north of Mount Longdon, codename Wing Forward, but in fact it didn't turn out to be that at all. And we were round to a flank with B Company going up on the high ground when we came under fire and had 2 people killed, with them Argentine machine guns firing from Longdon down onto us, and we were there sort of taking cover behind peat bogs and then putting fire back up. But because if you're in low ground firing uphill, it's actually quite difficult. Much the same, it's quite difficult if you're on high ground firing down. The beaten zone of the weapon systems. I mean, in some respects, the Argentinian positions should have been, from a defensive point of view, much lower down, and then their fields of fire would have been much stronger than they were, which again probably worked to our advantage, although we weren't fully aware of that on the night. And eventually we were called up by the CO. I mean, there was talk about us advancing across this open ground, but David Collett, and he was an experienced bloke, having served in 22 and that sort of thing, realised that was probably slightly suicidal. So we then went a slight detour and came up alongside B Company on the high ground, and then A Company cleared the rest of the mountain, and I along with a chap called Sammy Doherty. Sammy Doherty is now gone, died, I'm afraid. Chris Phelan, George Duffus, Bodge Cohen. We formed a sort of gun group of two GPMGs, and we fired the rest of A Company. And by this stage, and I mean B Company had this. The contacts were down to you're talking 20, 25 meters, if that, and in some cases shorter. And our contact, going down the ridge line, you're talking fire and maneuver at as I say, 20, 25 meters, if that. And eventually the mountain was cleared. We cleared it sort of by first light. And then at that stage, you couldn't really go on the southern side of the mountain because that was still overlooked by Tumbledown, which the Scots Guard hadn't been taken. So we were under then direct, and then we were then under observed fire. So both direct with RCL 105 RCL, and also artillery fire from indirect fire from the 105 pack house from Stanley. And so we sat under artillery fire with 105 and 155 for 48 hours, and lost, I think, at least another half a dozen people killed by shrapnel. And so we just occupied all we could do, because I mean it was occupied Argentinian positions, which, to be fair, were pretty well dug in with whatever. As I said earlier on, I think in some respects they would have been far better if they had sighted lower down in order to create better fields of fire for their own machine guns. But they certainly, saved us. And then we sat there until the Scots Guards had taken Tumbledown, and then during whatever night it was, 2 para came up and took Wireless Ridge, which was forward left of where Three Para. What was the big takeaway of all that for me, as I alluded to, earlier on in this chat, that there's no substitute really for utter professionalism. Yeah, you need to be physically fit, and you need to be well trained. And there's no there are no half measures there. I mean, if you're if you're not going to lose people uh, through well, careless. If you're not professional, if you don't approach it in a thoroughly professional way, and make sure as I say, you're fully focused, then you're going to lose people unnecessarily. And that experience, as I said earlier on, had a profound impact on particularly when I commanded C Company 3 Para, back end of the late 1980s. I mean, I was absolutely clear, what needed to be done. And in many respects, the Falklands War, albeit it took place in '82, it wasn't wholly different to those that our fathers and grandfathers would experience crossing the beaches in Normandy in 1944. I mean, infantrymen were armed with a rifle. We had machine guns. Okay, we had GPMGs rather than Brens, and indirect fire. And of course, the two things that kill in the infantry in those days, things have slightly changed now with drones and everything else, arguably. But indirect fire, mortars, artillery, and machine gun fire, they were the killers. Not Thomas with a rifle per se, but you needed to be able to you needed to know how to concentrate your firepower and how best to utilize that, and all those sort of lessons came out in terms of pairs fire and maneuver and small groups, etc., in the Falklands War. That's how it was won, and certainly the work that B Company did on Mount Longdon, and then taken over by A Company going down the ridge line. I mean, that was small groups of determined men, aided by indirect fire and to a degree and machine gun fire. As I say, and then when I commanded a company, we were still in that sort of scenario, and you can only do that, if you've got well trained and there's good, and as you will know, if you've got a fit platoon, fit company, that in itself, you build this cohesion as a team, and everybody knows they can rely on each other, and you build this sort of camaraderie, which is absolutely vital to success. If you haven't got that, you ain't going to get very far, frankly. And I mean, I would argue even in today's, and things have changed, I accept that. But I mean, those things are just as important today as they were then, and will remain so. And you can only do that by realistic, hard training, and that's how you build a team. Certainly, when I commanded C Company 3 Para, every sort of 6 or 7 weeks, I would take the company down to Brecon for a week, and we just use the ranges there. Yeah, did we break the rules and all that sort of thing? Yes, of course we did, because frankly, you can't train people if you obey pamphlet 21 to the absolute letter. You don't get anywhere. So you've got to learn to take the odd risk in training in order to make it sensibly, as realistic as possible, because that's how soldiers gain confidence and how you build your team. And as I've said, repeating myself, without that, you ain't going to get very far. It's absolutely critical in terms of morale particularly, and of course this then impacts on what's your on sort of mental health, and that's and the best way to get round that is by hard physical training. Now the challenge, and I'm not sure I have the answers for this, is subsequent to that, because there's no doubt that uh, people have had some very gritty experiences in 1982, and we all know that a number of people have gone as a result of their experiences, which is tragic. And I say I'm not in, not in, I don't. I'm not going to try and make some great pronouncement here this morning on why that is so. Um, but it is indeed, a tragedy. And I suspect the same has happened with people out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Um, uh, I mean, just digressing slightly. I mean, I go to the Tayside and Grampian PRAs, and indeed there's quite a Grampian has got quite a hard core of ex-regular paratroopers, some of whom were down in the South Atlantic. Indeed, a couple of them were in my company and C company, three para. And I mean those sort of groupings I think can be really important. People just need to be able to, because as you can't really explain to Joe Public. I mean, unless you've experienced uh, what we've experienced, it's very difficult to explain. And that sort of camaraderie, I think, within the sort of ex uh, regimental associations and the like, I suspect it can be very critical to people. I mean, yeah, there's great fun. We go on the lash, but for some, it's probably much deeper than that. Um, they draw probably a huge amount of strength from being amongst people that they know have experienced what they've experienced. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Absolutely, and I talk about it a lot as like the gatherings like the PRA meetings and kind of these walk and talk events with veterans and not just veterans, people, anyone that's struggling, they get together and being around like-minded individuals that can kind of expand on experiences and talk about those sort of things. Now I don't claim to have experienced anything like the Falklands. I experienced a fair bit in Iraq as a private security consultant after, but like I've lost a lot of friends over the years through suicide, and I just encourage people to reach out and talk to other veterans about their experiences. And that's what the aim of the podcast is to kind of, if you get people
Yeah,
like yourself as veterans, high ranking former officers, to say, look, it's okay to meet up in groups and talk and share your feelings. It doesn't have to be on the lash or on the piss. It can be done in an environment, and I think that's an important message that I'm constantly trying to push and try and to get out there. Um, so no, thank you, for sharing about the Falklands. For me, the Falklands was instrumental in why I joined the Parachute Regiment. And a lot of other people that I know. And it helped push me through depot, which I found really difficult at the time.
yeah.
What I also want to touch on, sir, if you're happy to, I'm conscious that obviously we're coming up to an hour point, so I don't want to keep you, but I'd like to talk about what we don't touch on and what we don't know about a lot about officer training. We know a lot about senior Brecken, we know a lot about juniors because they kind of talk, but officers' courses, what are they like as far as when you're moving forward and you're going through the promotional trail?
Um, well, if I go back to where I started at Mons Officer Cadet School, I mean, those Mons Officer Cadet School was just teaching somebody to be a commissioned officer for 3 years. So arguably in those days, I mean, um, you may not have got, you may have just been a second lieutenant for 3 years. So it was a mixture of um, teaching you to. I mean, we lived in Spiders in a barrack block. I mean, it was completely unlike Sandhurst where people had sort of single rooms or whatever. We were not. it wasn't much, much the same as being in depot para, frankly. So a lot of the training was based around just teaching a recruit. And then on top of that, there were, we did a lot of quite a lot of signals work and general military knowledge. But it's at its core was being taught to be, frankly, a private soldier. And of course, it was run rather like Sandhurst. I mean, all the platoon staff were, your platoon sergeant was a guardsman, so quite a lot of drill. Yeah, we were basically being taught to be a private soldier with add-ons, but all fairly low level. And at that stage, you see, and I think it was to change in '72. At that stage, if you wanted to be a regular officer, you went to Sandhurst, and it was a 2-year course. And there would have been a lot of academic training in that. I mean, you would have done the basic training as we did at Mons, but then there would have been, kind of, 2 years, kind of lengthy academic phase, etc. And that all came to a close in 1972. And I think, with all respect, the army then struggled a bit, really, how best to. Then Sanders then changed, I think, to 6-month course, and I think they tried to combine Sandhurst from 2 years and Mons into a sort of 6 to 9 month course. And that went on for quite a long time, and I don't think was particularly successful. I think there were various, and I haven't got all the detail. I wasn't there, although I was to go back. In fact, after commanding C Company 3 Para, I went to Sandhurst Victory College as a college chief instructor when it had changed, and we were then on effectively just under a year, probably 9-month course. Which was much more balanced in terms. But I mean, the basic building block was people were taught as if they were a private soldier in terms of drill, weapon training, field craft, etc., etc. And then added on that were the sort of academia, leadership training, command task training, etc., etc., which was very separate. And then the exercises were, were much the same, starting off with very basic, living in the field. Again, you would be familiar with that with the early days in Depot Para, and then building on that through defence exercises, and all of which would have had, command tasks with somebody chosen to have to prepare orders, give orders, etc., etc. So I don't know if that's not too clear or that answers the question. But that was basic officer training, and then later on, in those days there was a thing called the Junior Division of Staff course. In fact, I did that after I'd been an adjutant for 2 years, and the whole purpose of it was to teach you how to be an adjutant. Well, I did it the wrong way round. And then the Army Staff course in your early 30s. You had to be selected to go to the Army Staff College. And in those days, the first time you go was in your 32nd year. And that was all based on command or being the brigade major of an army brigade or whatever in the British Army on the Rhine. That was its basic building model, but I mean it had all sorts of modules built in it. It was that was a 12-month course, which was in many respects that was a defining moment in your you needed to go to staff college if you were going to go on and up. Yeah. There we are.
No. Like I say, it's good to get an insight because we hear a lot of, obviously being, a Lance Corporal. I know about the Lance Corporal course, and then obviously juniors and seniors. I know a lot of people have done that. It's just we don't hear necessarily about the career courses that officers go on. I should imagine they focus heavily on tactics, obviously, because that's kind of a big role in leadership and stuff, like you've alluded to there. But obviously, moving forward through your career, obviously you've had some sort of really prominent, legendary roles, if you like. OC a 2 para, which obviously my battalion, the best battalion in my opinion, and then obviously you kind of brigadier of 5 Airborne Brigade. Now I have a story that I was actually in a stick with you on a parachute jump. I can't remember the year. I cannot. It's a long time ago, but I think it was a brigade jump or a battalion jump. It must have been a brigade jump because you were involved. I remember the RAF coming back and saying that the winds were really high and it didn't look possible that we were going to jump. And so the rumour has it, you turned round and went, my men will jump, and we ended up jumping. Can you remember that story at all, sir?
Yes, I think it was. I think what happened was that the forecast was poor, and I think I turned round and said to the aircrew, or the aircrew briefing, right, well, there is always a window, a minute or so either side of first light when the winds drop historically, and I said, well, go then, and they all looked at me and sort of giggled and laughed, and I said, no, that's when we'll fucking go then, and we did, and we dropped.
Stories from the edge where the healing begins.